while back I made a video about why it's hard to bounce a ball under a table. It always wants to come back to you because of backspin. And I got a few comments along the lines of, well, that's cool and everything, but what's actually happening during that collision? How does backspin actually change the direction of the ball? I want to see that collision close up in slow motion to see what's going on. So of course I had to do that, and I discovered some really cool things along the way. Collisions that don't involve spin are easy to understand by making these simplifying assumptions that just work. You don't need slow-mo to understand it. But when you try to do the same with spin collisions, you end up with all sorts of problems. Let's look at collisions that don't involve spin first, because I want to show you how making one simplification allows you to explain the behavior of a huge range of different collisions. So at first glance, it might seem quite complicated. To work out what the velocity of the ball will be after the collision, we need to work out the change in its momentum. Momentum changes when a force is applied. The momentum changes larger when the force is larger and when the force is applied for a longer time. So we need to know the size of the force and the duration of the collision. And if we multiply the two together, we get the change in momentum, sometimes called the impulse. And you can see that it's the area under this force-time graph. But measuring the force and duration is going to be really difficult. And in reality, the force changes over the course of the collision, so we need to do an integration to get the impulse, to get the area under the graph. We're screwed, basically. And this is where the simplification comes in. So what physicists say is, look, don't worry about the details. Don't worry about how high the force gets, how long the collision lasts. It's the area that's important. Like if you double the force but halve the duration of the collision, the area would still be the same. And so physicists say, like, if we can find another way to work out what the area under the graph should be, what the impulse should be, which tells us the change in momentum, then we don't need to worry about the shape of it, because that won't affect the end result once the collision has finished. In fact, let's just assume that it's arbitrarily thin. Let's assume that the collision is instantaneous. So what is this other way of working out the area under the graph, the impulse? I'll get to that in a sec, but first a note about instantaneous collisions. Real collisions are never instantaneous. And you might already be thinking, well, hold on, if the collision has a 0-second duration, then the force must be infinite at that single moment in time. And that's true, and generally in physics, we don't like infinities. And anyway, how could you work out the area under a graph that's infinitely thin and infinitely tall? 0 times infinity is undefined, except in this case it is actually defined because it's the limit of a graph that has a fixed area underneath. I'm getting into the weeds there. So back to the question, how do physicists decide what the area under the graph should be, what the impulse should be? Well, you start by making another assumption. You assume that the collision is perfectly elastic. That means that the momentum of the ball coming out of the collision is the same as the momentum of the ball going into the collision, except reversed. So let's define down as the negative direction, and let's imagine we have a ball with a momentum of -1 going into the collision. If it's perfectly elastic, it'll have a momentum of +1 coming out of the collision. So then the change in momentum is +2. The impulse is +2. Now, not all collisions are perfectly elastic. But what's great is you can take all the complexity of, like, you know, thinking about the material properties of the ball and the surface, like how is energy dissipated, what's the damping like, and you just roll it into a single number called the coefficient of restitution. Perfectly elastic collisions have a coefficient of restitution of 1. Perfectly inelastic collisions have a coefficient of restitution of 0. If a ball has half the speed coming out of the collision than it had going in, then that's a coefficient of restitution of 1/2, and so on. So again, the details don't matter. You just measure the coefficient of restitution for your two objects by observing a collision. And typically it stays fairly constant over a wide range of velocities, so you can then predict and model different scenarios. But if you try and do the same thing with collisions involving spin, it goes wrong. Like, there doesn't seem to be a way to make a simplifying assumption that nicely predicts the direction and spin of the ball after the collision. But before we get into all of that, here's a qualitative description of what's going on. When a spinning ball hits a surface, it experiences friction. Friction always acts in the opposite direction to the direction of motion. So here, where the surface of the ball is traveling to the right, it's going to experience friction pointing to the left. And when an object experiences a force to the left, its velocity increases in that direction. So we see that the ball gains some horizontal velocity towards the left. But because the force is being applied off-center, relative to the center of mass of the ball also experiences a torque, a twisting force. This torque is clockwise, which is opposite to the way the ball is spinning, so we expect the angular momentum of the ball to decrease, which is what we see. But when you try to analyze it quantitatively, things go wrong. Like, it starts off well, and I really like this. This is probably the favorite thing that I've learned from making this video. What you normally think of as the coefficient of restitution, which is, the ratio of the momentum of the ball coming out of the collision to the momentum of the ball going into the collision, that's actually just the vertical coefficient of restitution. There's also a horizontal coefficient of restitution, and it has some weird properties. Looking back at the script, I say horizontal coefficient of restitution a lot, so I'll be abbreviating that to HCR throughout the video. So I just want to be really clear about what the horizontal coefficient of restitution is. Like, imagine this ball is coming in. It's a really oblique angle, so we only really care about the horizontal component of the coefficient of restitution. And imagine for some reason this ball isn't able to spin. I don't know why or how that would be, but just imagine it, right? So the ball hits the surface. I can feel the resistance there. So the ball is deforming elastically, it's storing elastic potential energy, and then it springs back, making the ball travel back in the direction that it came, right? So if the collision had an HCR of 1, it would bounce back at the same speed that it came in with, if it wasn't able to spin. So it's about the contact point, right? It's not about the center of mass of the ball, it's about the point where the ball touches the floor. And that's important because balls actually can spin, of course. So with an HCR of 1, it's that point on the ball that's traveling backwards compared to the speed it came in with. But the ball itself is still traveling to the right. The ball must be spinning like crazy for the bottom of the ball to be traveling backwards. Something unusual about the HCR is that it's very often really close to 0. And remember, when the vertical coefficient of restitution is 0, that corresponds to the ball stopping dead. So why would the HCR be 0 so often? Well, it's because static friction is stronger than kinetic friction. Take this collision, for example. This is a pool ball, and I'm kind of simulating it bouncing off a pool table cushion here. Having some give in the cushions on a pool table extends the duration of the collision. And watch what happens. To begin with, the ball is sliding against the surface. Sliding surfaces experience kinetic friction that slows the rotation of the ball and gives it some horizontal velocity. Eventually, the two surfaces are moving slow enough relative to each other that static friction kicks in and they grip each other. In other words, the ball is now rolling, which is to say the surface of the ball is not moving relative to the green baize. And if two surfaces aren't moving relative to each other after a collision, we say that the coefficient of restitution is 0. That doesn't mean that the center of mass of the ball isn't moving horizontally. It means that the contacting surface isn't moving horizontally. It means that the horizontal velocity and the rate of spin are now linked. The horizontal velocity is the angular velocity times the radius of the ball. Thinking about it like that, it seems weird that the HCR would ever be greater than 0. But in the same way that a non-spinning ball compresses on collision, which stores elastic potential energy, then releases it for the bounce, when a spinning ball hits a surface, it wants to keep spinning, but the friction is stopping it. Because it's elastic though, it will twist up, storing elastic potential energy until it can't twist anymore, before releasing that energy in an opposite twist. So the HCR can be anywhere between -1 and +1, and brilliantly we have a couple of equations that make use of it. The equation for the horizontal velocity after a collision looks like this, and the spin after the collision looks like this. I won't go into the derivation, but I will leave a link to a paper in the description. The point is, we seem to have achieved for spin collisions what we did for non-spinning collisions, which is to hide all the details behind a coefficient of restitution. And because the vertical component of the collision is independent of all this shenanigans, we really do have a simple description of everything that's going on without having to worry about the details, like, what is the actual force and duration of the collision, or what is the actual torque changing the angular momentum of the ball. It's all hidden away behind those coefficients. I mean, it's worth acknowledging that these equations aren't necessarily intuitive, but if you put in specific values for the HCR, like 1 or 0, then intuitive results do come out. And look, I captured a bunch of these scenarios. Like here, the HCR is really close to 1, I think, in which case we expect the ball to end up spinning in the opposite direction, which is what we see here. Here the HCR is less than 1, and I believe that's because energy is being dissipated in the wobbliness of the ball. Here's a much more extreme version of that. Here the HCR is really close to 0, like we discussed before. But what about this one? Look at this tennis ball. The bottom surface of the ball is traveling to the right before the collision, and it's still traveling to the right after the collision. So this collision has a negative HCR. Which is weird, isn't it? That's something that just can't happen with the vertical component of coefficient of restitution. It happens because the collision time isn't long enough for static friction to kick in and bring the HCR up to 0. That's also true for this collision, though it's less obvious. The issue here is that the collision time is just insanely short. Quick tangent. Real-world collisions can get really close to instantaneous, or at least on, like, human perception time scales. And we know from the discussion of impulse earlier that the force must be really high for short collisions, which I demonstrated about 1,000 years ago in one of my very first videos. You can just about see in this SD footage that the force between these really stiff steel balls is enough to bust a hole in this sheet of paper. End of tangent. So it seems like we have some simple equations where we can plug in some measured values and then model and predict the behavior of spinning collisions. So where's the problem here? Well, the horizontal coefficient of restitution doesn't just depend on things like, how squishy is the ball, how does the ball dissipate energy. It also depends on this relationship between static friction and kinetic friction. And all that depends heavily on the parameters of the collision, the angle and the velocity and the spin of the ball going into the collision. So collisions that don't involve spin are easy to model and understand intuitively because we can make the reasonable assumption that the coefficient of restitution stays fairly constant over a wide range of collision velocities. But that's just not true for the horizontal coefficient of restitution. It's really just not a constant in any useful sense. You can see that with these two collisions. On the left, static friction kicks in, meaning after the collision, the ball is spinning at just the right speed so that the bottom surface is stationary in the horizontal axis. In other words, an HCR of 0. Whereas on the right, static friction never takes over and the HCR is negative. I achieved that difference by making the surface less slippery on the left, but it could just as easily have been because the ball wasn't spinning as fast on the left or was coming down faster. But I had that idea after the higher camera had gone home. By the way, if you're wondering how I got the ball spinning so fast for those collisions, this is how. What's really nice about this analysis, though, is that it has its uses. The paper linked in the description analyzes tennis specifically. They found that within that specific analysis, static friction always kicked in at some point, and so the HCR was always somewhere between 1 and 0. And between those two extremes, actually, the exit angle didn't change that much. Weirdly, exit spin was harder to predict, but the angle was fairly consistent. We can also apply this to the original ball under a table video and see that our assumption that the ball rolls during the collision isn't right. That's like saying that the HCR is close to 0, but the spin changes direction, meaning the HCR is closer to 1. So it's been really cool to see how making simplifying assumptions, like we do in physics all the time, has still been useful in this scenario. But it's also cool to know that when my brain says, hold on, I'm going to need to see that close up and in slow motion, there's actually a good reason for that. There was a big aha moment in this video for me. It was when I was seeing if I could analyze what was going on in terms of the conservation of angular momentum, where I realized that the angular momentum of a spinning object is independent of where you choose the origin to be. So it makes sense to put the origin in the middle of the object to make that calculation easier. And then you can move the origin somewhere else for a different calculation, and that angular momentum that you calculated earlier is the same as it was before. And if there's now some translational motion, well, you just add the angular momentum from that to the angular momentum that you already calculated. But just seeing how angular momentum behaves in this particular problem that I was working through really helped to solidify how it all works and clear up a few misunderstandings that I had about it. Which reminds me of a correction I should make, actually. In the ball under a table video, I said that at one point angular momentum is converted to linear momentum. That's not how it works. They're both conserved values independent of each other. Anyway, the point is, I feel like I have a new skill now. And I get the same feeling with the sponsor of this video, Brilliant. Like, these aha moments always come when I'm working through an actual problem, and that's what Brilliant is all about. It's a platform where you learn by doing, with thousands of interactive lessons in mathematics, data analysis, programming, and AI. They build up your understanding from first principles with lessons that are filled with problem-solving interactive elements that let you actually play with the concepts. I find that I'm on Brilliant most days. Like, I don't play games on my phone anymore. I'm just on Brilliant instead. Going back to angular momentum though, it's a bit more complicated than I described because angular momentum is actually a vector. So you're doing vector manipulation when you're working with angular momentum. But luckily for me, I'd already worked through the vectors lesson on Brilliant, so I had that skill that I could put another skill on top of. You can try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for 30 days if you go to brilliant.org/SteveMould, and you can get 20% off an annual premium membership if you choose to subscribe. The link is also in the description, so check out Brilliant today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, don't forget to hit subscribe, and the algorithm thinks you'll enjoy this video next.